Perfect. So let's kick it off. Today is May 31st, and I welcome everyone on the show, on the VEBA call, public VEBA community call. I have some minor things on the agenda list for today, but I think we'll have a lot of time for open discussion if needed. Otherwise, we'll make it a quick one today. Before we kick it off, David, William, Ala, any points for the agenda? Any questions?
Nothing additional from me. I'm just here to listen and learn, and yeah, eager to hear updates about the upcoming release.
You're always welcome. All right, so then let's start with the milestone. So the 0.7.3 release, it was scheduled actually for April, but we slipped because there were a couple of open issues, and then my whole May was basically just purely travel. And so we stalled a little bit, but we got some good contributions also from David. They are already closed, and we have some minor remaining, more like documentation and small changes that are left for 0.7.3. So I'm positive maybe in the next 2 weeks or so we can close them off. I don't know, this is a Python one, David, if you have resources to look at this. I think this is purely a version bump thing. I don't know. I mean, Daryl seems to be busy these days. So if, David, you have some capacity, you might want to look at this one. It's probably just minor. Cool. Let me just ping you on the issue.
Yeah, I'll remind.
Perfect. All right, then I did, together with Steve Wong, I did a KubeCon talk in Valencia, KubeCon Valencia, and we had roughly 100 people showing up, which was impressive given, it was a Friday afternoon in a very corner place somewhere in a different building. So I was positively impressed with the turnout. And I gave presentation on VEBA and VEBA for vSphere admins, and also what it can do in terms of some operational day-to-day things that you might face, like tag misalignments with Kubernetes and like zone topology issues. And then the other one was like the canonical Slack integration example. So I gave that. The code is all up here in that repository, and it has like a whole step-by-step walkthrough of all the scenarios that I gave, and even the YouTube recordings for that. And we had a lot of good questions from the audience which were there, and mostly, oh, well, that's also already very useful. The events viewer is nice. I didn't know that existed, and so on. So it was good advertising for VEBA, definitely on that.
Yeah, I even saw some folks on Twitter saying that they were getting excited to try it out or have tried it out. So it sounds like a great session. Do you know what the makeup, I was going to ask, do you know what the makeup of the audience was? Were like these developer infrastructure folks that had experience with vSphere, or what was the makeup?
Yes, I asked. They were like 90% or so were all vSphere. Okay. Like maybe even higher. Like all hands went up. Yeah, infrastructure. It was all infrastructure folks. Which was okay because we had a couple of other Knative related sessions for those already, familiar or more developer side. And that's why I also kept it like the demos, they were all focused on vSphere, vSphere use cases.
Oh, very cool.
And that one, yeah. And they are reusable demos. And like, for example, the code for the tag drift, that's all here. The function is there. So we can even use that for other sessions if needed. Yeah, so that's all I had for today. Just those two kind of minor things, more like base work stuff, not so much fancy stuff for now. Comments, questions, discussions, issues from your end, David, maybe?
Well, we could, so one of the last PRs I was working on, which one was it? It was the one to fix the quoting issue.
Yes.
And it took me ages to test that. While I was doing it, I mentioned a rabbit hole I found myself in. I did wonder about whether there was some work we could do around the those scripts that are run when the appliance is first built to make that or make changes in that area just a little less scary and a bit easier to test and swallow.
Probably not these ones. Go back, Michael. It's probably in the it's in files.
Yeah.
And it's probably is it setup.sh?
Yeah. And the stuff that struck me is there's all that section there right at the top of the file that's populating variables. And then lower down we do.
Yeah, it needs to construct the is it line 80, or are you referring to the I think I constructed JSON file?
Yeah, so there's all that bit there where we create escaped versions of the variables that are then used in the JSON file at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you some quick background on it. Yeah, it's not ideal. There's a couple of things happening here. Because most of the setup script, you know, they're doing basically operating system level configuration changes, right? Yeah. Bash tends to be ideal for some of those things, and that's kind of the history behind it. And so we kind of have to deal with input coming through OVF to handle basically operating system changes. And then I would say a subset, like maybe 80% of those parameters need to then get fed into a different subsystem for basically setting up the Kubernetes infrastructure and all the different files. And then they're expected to go through, you know, a particular format. And so you're kind of dealing with like literally two different operating environments that, you know, handle things, strings, quotes slightly differently. And that obviously created all sorts of challenges. Now, the benefit there was that initially this was all done through shell scripting, and some of these things is easier and other things are extremely difficult. When we started to go into patching YAML files, you know, like you don't want to do that basically, right? There's a bunch of sed. And so this is when we kind of brought in the introduction of YTT to basically templatize a lot of these things, right? But through the use of YTT, there are certain expectations because now you're dealing with the YAML formatting. And so strings and all that kind of stuff needs to kind of get handled in that slightly differently. So this is kind of why, you know, when you kind of handle the inputs, if there are bugs in there, they kind of potentially is a multiplier because you kind of have to deal with it in these shell environments and making sure that there's no regression there. And then that same way of dealing with the variable parameters also need to work perfectly fine in kind of the YAML-based environments. And so it's very possible that you hit a bug, you solve it in one place, you can introduce a bug elsewhere. And we've had that a couple of times actually. So that's the background. Certainly open to, you know, improving that and how we best take that. You know, so a lot of it is sort of like the history behind it. And so it may require massive amounts of refactoring to get this working. You know, like if you wanted to kind of maintain it in one tool or language, you know, some of this parsing stuff, you know, I know that you have the OVF property file, but we know ultimately we're just parsing kind of like XML. So that's certainly ideal there. So I'll take a pause there, but that's kind of like the background for why we have some of what looks like complexity added to the setup scripts.
Yeah, and I kind of assumed that, you know, it's I've been using and looking at VEBA for long enough to have seen this grow and develop. So you introduced the YTT stuff, and that one makes loads of sense. I remember my thoughts around it, and I don't know what you guys think, but were that the get OVF properties Python file could generate the JSON file quite easily, and potentially generate all these bash variables as well. But my biggest thought around it all was whether we could figure out some way of doing some unit testing around it of some kind, or functional testing. Because the thing that hurts, much as you just alluded to, is you try a use case, so you deploy the whole appliance with a particular use case, and it takes ages, and then you come upon a bug, so then you try and fix the bug, and you're messing around in the terminal of your broken appliance, and you're big there loads of time.
Totally.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree. I think even before we even do some of like the Yeah, so I think we can certainly do that in like one Python script to generate some of these things. So it reduces like how you basically process variables and put them in the right structure. I think that's a great idea. I think that in itself could be an enhancement there. But I think sort of like reducing that feedback cycle and having better unit testing, because there are all these scenarios that we kind of know what they are. And I'm sure like a year from now, somebody will like use something and they're like, oh man, how like, oh, did we test that? And right now you're right, we don't have an easy way of unit testing some of this input, because ultimately you kind of have to have it go through the system, through the OVF properties, but we kind of know what that looks like already, right? So we can, in theory, could come up with those scenarios and test it out. And yeah, I don't, I'm not a developer, so I know that we should have unit testing, how we go about that. And I think there even is some basic unit testing frameworks for even like Bash and all that, but totally open if you've got ideas or if you've seen implementations. But I think it is worthwhile to maybe have something there, just because that kind of user input, you know, has been historically kind of the pain points, especially for things like network proxy, because not only is the thing that you're trying to configure difficult to test, but then obviously this whole end-to-end, you know, user input from OVF all the way down into these lower level scripts and all that, it's extremely difficult to test for most folks, right? So even if they wanted to contribute, it's difficult. So I think it's a very fair statement. I don't know, Mike has any thoughts or feedback around like how we might try to introduce some basic functional testing or unit testing for these areas. But that I feel like that's where we spent the bulk of the time. Other things are just minor, you know, changes from, you know, container D or versions of Kubernetes, and all those things are easy things that, you know, it just comes with it. But I feel like this is an area that's, it's pretty daunting, right? And I think there's only been a handful of folks that have been able to grok it. I think, David, you're probably one of the big contributors here, just because you've got that history, and you've been helping out, you know, keeping this simple and all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I got stuck with, because I've done loads of unit testing in Python, but when it came to the appliance build stuff, I was like, oh gosh, how do you even start unit testing around that? And it felt like before we started making any changes and incorporating a bit more Python or something into the setup script, it'd be good to get some baseline tests in first.
Right.
But yeah, then I got stuck.
Because I mean, in theory, what we can do, because when we do that OVF, you know, parameter, you know, just for background, right? Like there's this, you know, variable that gets passed into this utility, and basically it reads it, and what it looks like is basically an XML structure. So in theory, we could say, hey, you know, here's a good input, you know, here's some bad inputs, especially for the ones that we've come across, and we should be able to go back into past issues or PRs that touches this file to say, hey, special characters, all sorts of like, all right, there's a handful of them, right? And so we can certainly mock that that input, right? And then that becomes, you know, and we can do it similar to like how we do function examples, where like, hey, here's a mock event for, you know, migrated or something. So we can mock all the use cases. And then, you know, there could be a script that basically reads that mock in, and then basically attempts to run through some of this setup and see if it, you know, passes it, and then generates a JSON file. You know, those would be kind of like the basic things I can think out of the top of my head, but, you know, maybe Michael may have some additional feedback.
I think David has a good point, right, on this whole variable dance that we are doing here. So one option would be to extend this one, or have another Python file, because Python seems to be a language that a lot of us could use and catch up easily.
Yeah.
And then at least replace all of this, right? And then just have the shell script kick off the whole process then.
So it'll be responsible for setting those shell variables basically then.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, as long as it's setting that up, because the shell variables still need to exist, right? So
yes, exactly.
Yep. Yeah. So as long as it does that, yeah, the JSON file is kind of like, that was kind of like a poor man's way of setting that up. And I think even in the JSON, I only create the variables that I need, not necessarily for everything, but it doesn't hurt if you have more variables in there. So yeah, that could certainly cut down that chunk of code in the JSON creation itself, right? So
yeah, those are set here, right? The variables, and then they are used.
Yeah, there's a subset. They're used throughout, and then it's so that's why it's kind of that's why we have it in setup.sh, because this ends up being kind of like the global file. It executes, right? So in scope, and then the JSON thing, I only take a subset of these variables that are needed for the YTT transformation. So not all of these things are necessary, but we can easily do that.
Yeah, one option would be to generate a shell environment file, which we can easily source. So the Python,
that could also
right? We would just create a temporary file which you source in here. So you call whatever setup variables, and then you source them, and then you call setup or create JSON, blah blah, and those could be Python methods or tiny snippets which we can easily test.
Right. Yeah, that's true, because then each of those could be mocked. Yeah, so you can mock the initial inputs, and then that initial input can then will go through the driver script to create that environmental file and source all that.
Yep, exactly. David, I think it's a fair point. I'll leave it up to you if you wanna approach this. It's
so when I was working on that last PR, the rabbit hole was I started going down the route of trying to see if I could figure a way around this, and I actually got to the point of it's not all working, but that's where I was like, I could really do with some test cases here to know that I've not broken anything, because it's obviously fundamental to the whole product. So I gave up and parked it all in a branch in my local repo and went back to fixing the problem at hand. But I like the idea of sourcing. The way I wrote it in my rabbit hole experiments was to run an eval, which resulted in all the variables in the bash script correctly, but sourcing feels like a better and cleaner way, because then you've got the file left over and you apply the debugging and stuff as well. That's need to work.
We had some problems with eval depending on which scenario you're solving for. So the eval gave us some other problems to debug. I remember I had to debug with Michael a while back ago when we used eval. So because of the way the shell was transforming, and then how is Python handling it, you get into all these weird scenarios. And so ideally it's sort of like one thing that handles the transformation. And I think from a sanity point of view, at least to verify that you didn't break anything, is you could use sort of like a couple of scenarios, like a sane setup, and making sure that your transformation equates to the same set of environmental variables if you were to transform it manually, right? So if it was being sourced from a file, you could do a diff between that. And then generally where I see things are potentially gets broken is around the password fields, the use of special characters, those types of things. And so I think if you wanted to test it generally, that's where it was at. And so, use the same input. And then especially if you go through the debugging process, you'll see what each variables actually the values are supposed to look like, at least from the shell environment, and you could compare and contrast. That way it should give you at least a first order of whether or not you've done anything that would significantly differ from the current set of scripts. But yeah, it is a little bit of trial and error, but I think it is a very worthwhile effort if it's something that you want to attempt and tackle, and we'd be more than happy to support you and figure out how do we kind of get that.
I mean, so there'd be some, if I was to have a go at this, then some input around the sort of known things that you've seen before that have been problematic.
Yeah, what we can do maybe we can file an issues for that. Maybe one to basically decompose this, and then what I can do is we can go and look back through the issues around passwords and special characters, and kind of put down those use cases and say, hey, these are the 3 or 4 cases. There's only been a handful, really. It's more of just like, do we fix it here? Do we fix it there? Kind of thing. And then between which environment. And so sometimes we've actually seen the same bug come up, right? It's like sort of escaping for the bash stuff gets solved, but then the eval escaping thing then breaks like the YTT stuff because we just made certain assumptions. And so those are some of the things that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I think those are the ones here, William, right? All caps.
All caps.
Eval.
Special, well, the eval broke some stuff. So yeah, it really is special characters. All caps seems to be like I mean, somebody just decided to use that, and we just wanted to better handle that. But I think it really is just
here's one from David. Yeah, there were a couple.
Yeah, there are a couple, but I think they all kind of reside on around use of certain characters, right? Because the $sign is a very special character that has certain meaning in Shell.
Yes.
So that broke.
And also in JSON.
Also,
as well.
also in JSON. And then we just had, arbitrary other characters that are considered special. And so either they should be treated as such. And so I feel like there's only a handful of scenarios. So we could at least start from there and see if we have any problems. But yeah, we had to do all sorts of funky things. It's not,
but David is right. It's much easier to do in a in a language which then produces like as a JSON parser, and then you just spit out the JSON.
Yeah. This is terrible right now because certain things have quotes, some of them don't have quotes. Yeah, so basically all the username and password you can see, they don't have explicit quotes because as part of the processing above it, it generates those quotes for you. And so there's all these like little stupid things that I'm sure if we put it all in Python, probably it all goes away. So we can start with that as a driver, is a couple of those use cases around special characters, and then just see if we are able to break this down and then get that working. And then, we may hit other bugs, but that'll just be part of the testing aspect, and happy to help test as well too, David, once you've kind of got that initial code base in.
Cool. Yeah, testing's the worst bit of this because of the complexity of, the time required to deploy the appliance and test all those use cases, isn't it? So, yeah. Well, I'll see what I can do. I might submit the stuff I started working on as a WIP PR, just for you to have a glance over and see what you think as a sort of a general concept, and then can.
Yeah, I think what we can do is if you can. So the way I'm thinking about this is that we need to. What we can do is we can write out the couple of scenarios we want to handle for, and then what I can do is deploy a couple of the appliances using a couple of those scenarios. So like one with a special character. And then basically what I can do is from the bash environment, which I think that should be sufficient, I will actually grab the XML payload for you, David. And then we can start with those as basically things that we would commit into the repo for basically unit testing, right? That way there will be a flow where you can make your changes and then you can test against these scenarios without ever having to build the appliance.
Yeah, I think that's the thing.
And if all that checks off for you, right, then what we can then do is then I can do a build of the appliance, right, and go through these scenarios end to end and see if anything else breaks, right?
Yeah.
That way you can iterate on the piece that really makes sense for you, and you don't have to wait for the other system, to get, because you shouldn't have to build the appliance every time you test. So I think that's the other thing we want to basically enable in this environment, right? So I can go through a couple of the scenarios and say, here's a sanity input, here's the same piece of input. Here's a couple of examples where these are quote unquote sane inputs, but historically has problems, right? And if you have like a driver script that can basically take that, right, and then that becomes basically quote unquote your input to your scripts, then you can iterate as fast as you need without actually having to build out the appliance. Because I think that's part of the challenge that we're seeing right now. That way in the future, if we have a bug coming in and somebody says, hey, I use like, the bracket character and it doesn't work, we can at least do the quick testing and say, oh yeah, it does work. Maybe it's broken elsewhere. That at least gives quick feedback to anybody that needs to help work on this thing. I think that piece of it, I think, will be something that will hopefully help accelerate the work that you're doing. That way you don't have to worry about like the building of the appliance. That to me is more of like this works, and then that just becomes an artifact of the system, right? So
yeah.
So what I'll do is I'll do that, capture those payloads. I'll just kind of paste them in GitHub once we have that issue filed. And then eventually, we should probably have like a unit test directory that will have these files committed into the repo. And then that will be basically our test input. And anytime we get future bugs where they're like, hey, I use this thing, we can just add that as another test case. Let me know if that makes sense, Michael.
It does. And for David, because you mentioned the work in progress, you can also create a draft PR.
Okay.
And so that won't be, we can't merge this if it's still in draft, and then you can change it basically to a real one.
Sure. Okay. Cool.
Yeah,
that was good. That was a good one, David. Anything else, David?
No, I don't think so. I think I submitted a little PR, didn't I? A colleague of mine found some documentation gotchas, but I think that was all cleared up. Yeah, all good.
Awesome. No, thanks for that feedback, David. Yeah, so once you get that issues filed or PR, depending on, yeah, we should probably file an issue anyways, that we can have that discussion there. And then I think later this week, hopefully I'll get some time. I'll just deploy a couple of appliances with varying types of input, and then I'll capture that for you, and then you can use that as your input stream for your scripts then.
Cool. Yeah. Very good.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Well, then I think then we got it. William, do you have anything left?
Nothing for me. No, I think we're just waiting on that last task from Daryl, right? For that 0.7.3, I think. Is that the only one left on the PR?
So that's the PR because I reviewed it. There's a bit of changes.
Right.
And then we have a couple of issues left here. Those are all minor.
Okay, so we got that one.
Broken link and contributing guide.
I feel like for that one, the doc update, we may just push that because I don't think that's necessarily mandatory, because this requires some, because it was, these were, I forgot, they're like either custom icons or, yeah, I don't feel like that's necessarily, yeah, because these weren't practicals. Yeah, I think he was relying on a library, so it's not an easy rip and replace, so that requires changes.
Good. This is easy. This is David, if he has time. And then there's 2 small updates.
2 small updates. Okay. So we still have a few more. Okay. Yeah, I guess we're not in a rush for 0.7.3. So I guess whenever these things get
I can probably also tackle them.
Okay.
Maybe this.
It sounds like the long poll would be maybe Daryl still has some changes he needs to do, and then if David has some cycles for the Python piece of it, then
I think this might be an easy one. I think it's literally just the requirements file which needs to.
Oh, literally just updating the requirements file.
Okay. I think.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, no, I was just kind of curious about it because I know that we had talked about getting that going, but yeah, no big rush. Okay, sounds good. Nothing else from me. Thanks.
Alrighty, so we can stop it then. We're good, and see you all in 4 weeks.
Sounds good.
Yep.